Hello. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And I hope that you've been enjoying this conference so far. My name is Ashlen Hilliard, and I am excited to spend the next roughly 20 minutes today presenting on my research on the relationship between reproductive coercion, psychologically abusive environments, and the extent of group identity in a sample of those who've left cultic groups. This research was conducted under the supervision of advisors Dr. Linda and Rod Duber-Marshall. Before we dive in, I wanted to provide a little bit more about my background and motivation for this research. Over the past 6 years, I have worked for multiple nonprofits in the cult recovery field. Many of you may have gotten to know me during my work with ICSA, where I worked for about 3.5 years. But prior to that, I worked as a case manager helping those leaving polygamous groups out west. I currently have my own LLC called People Leave Cults, where I offer cult intervention and mediation services for former members, their families, friends, and loved ones. I have been extremely fortunate to work with my mentors, Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly, who have been doing this work for over 40 years with families. And finally, in 2022, I graduated with distinction from the University of Salford with my master's in the psychology of coercive control, which is what I will be covering today, my research that fulfilled that program requirement. So what is reproductive coercion? Reproductive coercion interferes with an individual's rights and freedoms related to reproductive health care and decision-making in order to maintain power and control over the individual and prevent autonomy. This is the definition provided by researchers Grace and Anderson in 2018. Reproductive coercion can affect anyone, regardless of sex or gender. However, types of reproductive control can be sex or gender specific. In the case of women specifically, reproductive coercion may be perpetrated via sex that is coercive, unwanted, or non-consensual, and furthermore, uses women's reproductive capacity as a weapon against them. According to the literature, reproductive coercion can exist on both the interpersonal and also the structural level. However, prior research conducted on reproductive coercion has typically focused on coercion from an intimate male partner, from research studies that have occurred in family planning clinics, healthcare settings, or amongst populations who are at higher risk. And because of this, existing understandings in literature on reproductive coercion predominantly focus on the interpersonal domain and yield specific attention to this type of coercion as being inflicted from current or former intimate relationships, parents, or extended familial relationships. Contrast, reproductive coercion on the structural level is a broader area in need of further study. And studying reproductive coercion on the structural level may involve investigating numerous sources of influence. This may include societal, political, religious, socioeconomic, legislative, or even cultural factors that have the potential to impact women's autonomy. There is also the consideration that individual experiences may not fall neatly into one domain that characterizes reproductive coercion. For example, both the influences in the structural sphere and interpersonal pressures from extended family can present simultaneously. The confluence of these two domains can exist, particularly in abusive group settings, that create environments that may limit reproductive freedoms. If you're a survivor of a coercive group or relationship, it's possible that you may have experienced this firsthand. Destructive group settings, also commonly known as cults, can create psychologically abusive environments where reproductive coercion can undoubtedly exist and serve as an example of a type of coercion that a cultic group may employ to maintain power and control. So due to many factors at play within abusive group setting, interpersonal coercion and group influence in the structural domain can, of course, exist simultaneously. Reproductive coercion is not necessarily a relatively new phenomena amongst cultic groups. In the literature, there are discussions and research surrounding children who were born and raised in totalist systems, their needs after departure, as well as fatalities due to medical neglect in psychologically abusive systems. And I'm referring to research done by Abby Mitten in 2021, Goldberg in 2006, Asser and Swan in 2000. And in the book Misunderstanding Cults, a variety of groups were highlighted in the format of case studies, with more of an emphasis on child rearing issues in abusive group settings and less of an emphasis on analyzing the sources of reproductive control over individuals in those settings, according to Siskind in 2016. The Oneida community, the Children of God, and the International Society of Krishna Consciousness were some of the case studies examined. The Oneida community is an example of a Christian sect with roots in the Second Great Awakening that lasted from approximately 1843 to 1881. The group's ideology regarding procreation was determined solely by the leader of the sect, who determined whether or not couples were fit to have children, and the leader experimented with breeding amongst members, according to Siskind's research in 2016. Women during that time did not have the autonomy to decide when they would have children or with whom, for that matter. The Children of God cult in the 1960s encouraged marriage, but would not allow women to use birth control comparatively. The International Society of Krishna Consciousness, the ISKCON movement, mandated celibacy for individuals unless married. Then sex, of course, was for the sole purpose of procreation. Existing studies on reproductive coercion provide insight into the interpersonal domain, as discussed earlier. However, there's not been prior research on the complex experiences of individuals under the influence of a group environment, where there may be many variables that may limit reproductive freedom. Specifically, how reproductive coercion manifests in destructive group settings has not been researched, and what is known has only been anecdotally alluded to from survivor accounts. It is important to note that many different types of cultic groups are not held by religious tenets or motivators, according to Arnoff, Lynn, and Melanowski in 2000. Religion is just one example of a cultural factor that may influence reproductive health and decision-making, especially in destructive groups or cultic settings. While minimal research is available on cultural factors that drive reproductive coercion, there is research on cultural factors that can perpetuate an environment for both intimate partner violence and sexual violence, which includes the following characteristics often found in high control groups. For example, one of those is cultures that approve male violence, cultures that protect the good of the group at all costs, so one that has power hierarchies, and of course, patriarchal cultures. And this is according to research done by Marie Stopes, Australia in 2018. Due to the research gap surrounding experiences with reproductive coercion in cultic group settings, conceptually, this phenomenon needs to be approached with a lens that can account for the many variables involved in psychologically abusive group settings. Psychological abuse and group abuse often involve undue influence over the expression of sexuality, including reproductive decisions. For example, cultic groups may impact reproductive decision-making by restricting or banning sex for group members through the teachings and influence of a cult leader, and religious or cultural factors that are significant in forming group practices and beliefs. These examples illustrate different mechanisms of control employed in abusive group settings that may limit someone's reproductive health and decision-making. In addition, research demonstrates that individuals who experience coercion in cultic group settings are more likely to present identity issues, depression, and anxiety in varying degrees depending on several factors, such as the degree of identity placed in the totalist system, according to Duper-Marshall's research in 2010. So although the link between psychological abuse and group identity is established, the need to understand reproductive coercion experienced in destructive group settings is a relevant research area in need of further investigation. So this quantitative study is the first exploratory analysis of the complex experiences of individuals who have experienced reproductive coercion while under the influence of a cultic or destructive group setting. So my aims and objectives for this study was to research and to seek to understand the phenomena of reproductive coercion experienced by individuals who identified as female during their time in a cult or destructive group setting. People were eligible to participate if they were 18 or older and self-identified as someone who had been in a cult or destructive group that they had subsequently left. They identified as female while they were in a cult or a destructive group setting, and they experienced reproductive coercion at that time. So this quantitative study drew from a purposeful sampling of former cult members, and the relationships measured by the psychological abuse experience and group scale. It's known as the PEGS for short. The extent of group identity scale, the EGIS is its short form, and the reproductive autonomy scale. So empirical data gathered from this study sought to improve knowledge on 3 research aims and objectives. The first was to improve knowledge regarding destructive group influence and experiences of reproductive coercion in these settings. The second was to measure the relationships between psychological abuse experienced in groups, the extent of group identity, and reproductive coercion. And the third was to investigate whether group psychological abuse and the extent of group identity predict reproductive coercion, and to generate an understanding of how reproductive coercion manifests in cults from a sampling of those who've left cultic environments. And that was done, the fourth aim was done through a content analysis of the reproductive autonomy scale that I modified. So I wanted to real quickly discuss more about this reproductive autonomy scale. It's right here on the slide as number 5. It was developed by the researchers listed in 2014. And it measures, the reason why I chose it was it measures multiple facets of reproductive autonomy, specifically women's power to control matters related to their reproductive health. And while there is much overlap between the terms reproductive coercion and reproductive autonomy is a distinct concept from reproductive coercion because reproductive autonomy encompasses multiple factors, including societal and cultural pressures. So again, we're kind of looking at that structural domain that may impact an individual's ability to make reproductive health decisions. The distinction which makes this scale appropriate when considering the many factors of cultic systems that may inhibit reproductive rights and decision-making. So this scale was 34 questions, which included 3 subscales. Decision-making was one of them, freedom from coercion was another, and communication was the third. The participants indicated the degree to which they have experienced each factor by indicating 0 for never, 1 for sometimes, 2 quite often, 3 frequently, or 4 very often. For the purpose of this study, where reproductive coercion was being studied within cultic environments, it was necessary to adapt this scale. And I added new categories to determine if the participants experienced reproductive control during their time in a cultic group from their ideology, theology, cult leader, or a close relative or intimate partner while in the group. Participants were asked at the beginning of the scale to indicate who had the most say in different types of decisions. And the utilization of this scale was selected to provide insight into the extent and ways former members of cultic groups perceive that they have experienced reproductive coercion, and if there's a relationship between the psychological abuse experienced in groups, the extent of group identity, and reproductive coercion. So what were the results? I wanted to first discuss real briefly the demographic results. Initially, this project sought the participation of at least 60 to 100 participants from a purposeful sampling of those involved in cultic groups. The final number of participants in this research project was 99, which is very exciting. And it seemed like an appropriate sampling for an initial exploratory analysis. One of the eligibility guidelines required that participants identified as female during their time in the cultic or destructive group setting. Interestingly, 92 respondents indicated that they described their gender presently as female. This includes transgender women. And 4 respondents described their gender presently as male, which included transgender men, indicating that at least 4 respondents had transitioned since group involvement. 2 respondents preferred not to describe their gender presently. Participants self-described themselves as female, heterosexual, non-binary, cisgender, gender fluid, LGBTQ ally, male, she, her, they, them, agender, and straight. In addition, 96 respondents ranged from 20 to 85 years old, with an average participant age of 41 years old. 3 participants did not provide their age. What I thought was really fascinating was that 50.5% of the participants indicated that they were born and raised in a cultic group. And the responses provided indicate that 45 out of the 99 participants can probably be assumed to be first-generation former cult members. That's roughly 45.5%. So question 10 of my study asked which cultic group the participants had left. And this was not a requirement for people to answer. Some people did not want to share that information. But interestingly, the groups listed with the highest number of former members who participated were from the Church of Christ, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons. All three of these groups adhere to variations of Christianity and have origins from the Second Great Awakening in the United States, which was at a time of heightened religious fervor. Participants were instructed to leave the answer blank if their group had no name, or if they were in a cultic family system or one-on-one relationship. 10 participants preferred not to provide an answer to this question. So the group names of those who did share were consolidated into 40 individual listings. So I thought it was pretty cool that out of a sample of 99 people, there was only over 40 groups represented. And so these are the lists. I know that this text is probably small on your screen, but these are some of the listings of those 40 groups. So the statistical analysis, I want to get to that now. I ran lots and lots of statistical analysis on this data, on all these different subsets. If you have any individual questions, I can answer those as best as I can. I'm just going to highlight a few things that I thought were important to note with the data that was run. It was run on the SPSS version 27 software, and it was run on these scales to determine measures of central tendency and variability, descriptive statistics, including mean and standard deviation for each measure, which could be referenced in this table right here. You can briefly look over those numbers. So the Shapiro-Wilk test results for the complete PEG scale was significant, with a tested statistic of 0.931, which suggests that data on this measure was significantly skewed. The same skew was found with the reproductive autonomy coercion scale, with a statistics of 0.948. And sometimes when we get skews, in data and quantitative research, we kind of pause and we see, is it okay to proceed with running different tests if there's a significant skew? But in this case, the skew makes sense because of this purposeful sampling of survivors of abuse who were eligible to participate in this study. So in this case, the skew was not necessarily any sort of cause for alarm. Reliability statistics were also run on each subscale of the PEGs, which included the following factors and their corresponding questions. Originally, the PEG scale developed by Saldana, Rodriguez, Cabrera, Almendros, and Escartin in 2017 was tested on a sample size of 138 people. And so additional tests were run to test reliability. In this table, table 4, each subscale is listed with their corresponding Cronbach's alpha. And finally, a Pearson's correlation was carried out in order to determine if significant relationships exist between the scales. The Pearson correlation coefficient for the 99 total responses indicate the following: a small positive relationship between the PEGs and the reproductive autonomy scale coercion subset scores, with R equaling 0.282 and P equaling 0.05. As such, it was decided not to proceed with multiple regression analysis, as there were enough significant potential predictor variables for coercion and communication as subscales of reproductive autonomy. So what does this mean? Overall, one of the most significant data findings suggests evidence that those who were born and raised in cultic groups may experience reproductive coercion differently than first generation or those in family systems or one-on-one relationships. This conclusion was formed with multiple considerations. Firstly, the born and raised subgroup scored significantly higher overall on the reproductive coercion subscale, but significantly lower on the communication subscale of the reproductive autonomy scale. Secondly, in the study's context, it was originally predicted that the EGIS and the PEGs would show a significant relationship. In other words, the higher the indicators of identity in a totalist group, one would assume the higher the risk of psychological abuse reported in the group setting from former member survey participants. So therefore, measuring the environment of group psychological abuse with the PEGs alongside measuring one's identity in a destructive group setting with the EGIS was initially selected to provide more information on whether group identity can predict the extent of reproductive coercion experienced in groups. And it has been found that PEGs is significantly positively related to reproductive coercion. But in the absence of a significant relationship between EGIS and coercion, there was no rationale for multiple regression analysis involving PEGs and EGIS as predictor variables for coercion. So first generation former cult members scored higher on the extent of group identity scale than those born and raised on the mean scores, and this was approaching statistical significance. So this indicates that those who were born and raised may have less identification with the group than first generation members, which I thought was interesting. This could also suggest for future study and possible adaptation of the EGIS scale to measure the extent of group identity exclusive to those born and raised in cultic environments. Overall, there was no observable difference between these groups when examining the PEGs results. And this exploratory research suggests that future research on a larger scale should be encouraged with this population subset. Finally, I did a context analysis on the reproductive autonomy scale, which again is made up and comprised of these 3 subscales that you see on your screen: decision-making, communication, and coercion. And this was to accomplish the 4th aim of this research project, which was to understand how reproductive coercion manifests in cults from a sampling of those who've left cultic environments. I highlighted what I thought the most interesting findings from each subscale were. For example, with the decision-making index, for every question in the subscale, the results indicated that the cult ideological or theological beliefs or practices were selected the most by participants as having the most say into dictating their, reproductive choice and autonomy. In the coercion subscale, 80.8% reported that the cult's ideological, theological beliefs or practices never communicated the subject of consent when discussing sexual health and well-being. That is, of course, great cause for alarm. And the coercion subscale in cultic environments, it was found not to be the case that the partner was the primary source of the interference related to birth control sabotage, pregnancy coercion, or pressuring their partner into pregnancy. I thought that was really interesting. And it highlights how, in some cases, it's still possible to have an abusive intimate partner who is putting restrictions on your reproductive autonomy. But within the context of groups, the trend seems to be more related to the group ideological, theological practices that have put pressure on individuals and their reproductive freedom. So reproductive literature, in conclusion, in the field of cultic studies, highlights the effects that totalist systems can have on children or those born and raised in cults. But there's only anecdotal evidence in the literature from case studies that focus specifically on where the sources of control originate in creating an environment for reproductive coercion. Stigmatized and at-risk populations must be accounted for and represented in future data gathering surrounding reproductive coercion. In both interpersonal and group settings, reproductive coercion may not necessarily be the primary form of control, but used in addition to other types of harm that partners use to control victims, which can apply in the case of psychologically abusive systems as well, according to Lipton's work in 2012 and Grayson Anderson in 2018. Obtaining data from those who may not frequent healthcare settings, like those in cults, can be difficult. And the current research approach to the question at hand is based on the needs of those involved in often isolating systems of control. It is argued in the current literature that additional vulnerable population subsets should be treated as a high priority to improve reproductive health care for all, giving credence to the importance of this current study, which is what ultimately drove me to do this research. So I know that we flew through this material today. We were only together for a short time, and there's only a few minutes allotted for Q&A. I have a longer version of this research presentation available on my YouTube channel. The username handle is just People Leave Cults. And if you wanted to take a deeper dive, if you're attending the conference in person, I am here assisting with the family workshop with Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly and other talks as well. Feel free to message me on the app or catch me in person if you have any questions about this research. And I look forward to hearing your questions at this time. Thank you for being interested in this study.